Okay, so welcome to Centrefield, and today I have with me a person I deeply admire and a person who's influenced a lot of my work as well, Parth J Shah, founder of Center for Civil Society. Hello, Parth, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on this interesting discussion forum. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, I'm so glad that we're finally getting a chance to talk. And I think I'm also a little jittery because I see you as an intellectual, towering giant of sorts, as well as a dear friend. So I think those are both present in the space as we talk. And I think we've been having these conversations sporadically, but now finally we are here and part of a longer series of dialogues. So so glad that you're here. And there is so much actually. I mean, I was just thinking what are topics that we could speak about, and the landscape seemed fairly vast, from education to public policy to economics to land rights to I mean, I think I see you as a very, very diverse thinker. So I was wondering where to start from. And I think what I thought was a good place to start would be from the Swatantra Party. Uh, Swatantra Party, I don't think too many people know about Swatantra Party and the ideals it represented. And since this is a socio-political conversation also, curious about, yeah, what would you share about Swatantra Party, the ideals it represented, and where do they stand now? So maybe we could start off with that.
Sure, Abhishek. I think it's a great sort of way to start reminding our own history in the political arena of India. I think the Swatantra Party was sort of launched by Rajaji, largely in response to what he felt as an excesses of the Nehruvian sort of economic and social policies. Right? I think, as you know, the 5-year plan model that was adopted in the late 50s, the second 5-year plan became far more controlling, and which led to the license permit quota Raj, as Rajaji referred to the situation that emerged from the 5-year planning model. I think Rajaji felt that, I think, let me put it this way. I think in the beginning, most people in India, not just Nehru and the political leaders, but also I think industry leaders also believed in the mixed economy. So they all agreed on the idea that what's good for India is going to be sort of combination of public and private sector working together. So that sort of sentiment was also captured by the Bombay Plan, which was put together by Indian sort of industrialists, including Mr. Tata at the time, very actively involved in that process. And the Bombay Plan, if you read it now, is really a great manifesto in some sense of a mixed economy. Even the industrialists of India did not argue for a laissez-faire or a free market economy as we understand it today. So I think there was not as much dispute about that part of the approach to economic sort of policy, right? But I think Rajaji and then many others at the time felt that the things were moving far more in the direction of state control as opposed to being a mixed economy, right? And that's where I think the impetus for a new political party to challenge first the hegemony of Congress, right? Congress was the only sort of single party largely in the whole country, and also to provide an alternative way of thinking about sort of political, economic, social policy in India, right? And that's what drove, I think, Rajaji, Nilu Masani, Pilu Modi, and many others to the idea of a new political party. I think that's the sort of genesis of Swatantra Party. In my reading of the history, and this of course is disputed or not really agreed by all, is that one key reason for the urgency of Swatantra Party was the sense that India was moving towards collectivization of agriculture. Right? So India, as you know, the 5-year plan was really based on the Soviet model, and agriculture was actually state-run in Soviet Union. And I think sense was that India slowly moving in that direction. And that, of course, most of these people thought was a disaster, would be a great disaster for India. And so that, in my view, was the sort of immediate urgency of having a political opposition to stop the collectivization of Indian agriculture. Right. And so I think and they, in a sense, did succeed. I mean, one key thing in terms of policy the Swatantra has been able to do is to, in a sense, make it difficult for India to move in that direction in an overarching manner. Right. So that's, I think, a little bit about the history of Swatantra.
So, Parth, curious about how would you then look at what Gandhiji in a way was proposing as Gram Swaraj and a republic of 6 lakh villages and village self-sufficiency. And the Nehruvian model was, of course, the commanding heights of the economy and build the industry and so on. And then there is Swatantra Party, which is actually saying protect land rights and so on. So do you see any connections, overlaps or divergences with the Gandhian or Kumarappa kind of economics?
It's a very good question. I actually, in the last few years, I myself have been going back to sort of Gandhi's writings on this issue. In Swaraj, I think we read it together with some of my colleagues at CCS. We attended a couple of workshops also to go deeper into it. So I think I do have, I think, more sympathy for Gandhi's ideas around sort of what is commonly labeled as anti-technology, anti-modernization. I have little sympathy for that in some areas. I think overall, I do feel that the Gandhian model of self-sufficient village republics is not really a viable economic model. I want to use the word economic model specifically because I think in a political context, it's a great model, right? And I think my sense is that maybe Gandhiji overplayed that idea from politics to economics. I think in the political domain, it really makes sense. And I think the 73rd, 74th Amendment to the Constitution and then much of what has been discussed later on does talk about decentralization, giving powers to the local governments as much as possible. Right? I think in the political arena, the Gram Swaraj idea is a powerful idea. And if I think Gandhiji had advocated for politics part of it, probably it would have had much more resonance. And as you know, even Nehru was very dismissive of the idea of economics being done at the village level. So I think Swatantra would be somewhere in between, which is interesting sort of thing. So Swatantra was certainly not for commanding heights of the economy being controlled by the state, as the Nehruvian model or the Indian model would suggest. They were certainly not for village economic self-sufficiency idea. So they were in between. Right? I think that's an interesting position historically Swatantra in a sense fell into. I don't think it was by design. But I think Swatantra would have been far more open to more and more decentralization. One of the plank of party was to empower local governments. And that, I mean, if you had village governments working properly, it's possible that we would have a lot more economic activity also done at the village level, right? There was enough support from the political system to sustain that kind of division of labor at the village level. So one can argue that if he has been successful in political village republic, then maybe there will be more sort of movement towards economics also being run by village economies, much more so than otherwise would have been possible.
Right. Yeah. I think also for me, for a long time in the social sector, I would feel guilty about being a city person in a world where village life is so glamorized by so many Gandhian organizations. And when I read Tagore, in fact, and Tagore's vision around how the city and the village have to be in synergy with each other, and cities are literally like the chakras of the body, specialized energy centers from where things are moving in, and can they both be in harmony? I think that's when I finally was able to reconcile the differences, and I found that somehow a more progressive way of thinking about the coexistence of both, especially in today's world where we are like hurtling towards urbanization and movement towards the urban world. But I'll share two questions, Parth, and you can choose which one you want to kind of pursue. The first one is around economics and politics, right? Saying so one way I tend to look at politics is it's literally a manifestation of economics. Like ultimately, behind politics is economics, is how I imagine it to be, because ultimately the economic power wields the funding of party politics, and eventually the state decides which rights to protect, which rights to allow, what is the control over state resources. So one question is around the economics politics connection in today's world, and I'm also taking a leap into today because citizens are not funding politics, corporations are funding politics in large ways. And so the economics politics connection, I think, and how you look at it is kind of one question. And the other, if we want to continue on the Gandhian track, I would be curious about the non-violent economics, right? So while a lot of Gandhiji's ideas may not still be relevant, I think the idea of how does non-violence and trusteeship translate into economics in today's day and age? What would that look like? And what is your take on non-violent economy? Or, I mean, do you see markets as innately being the best non-violent form, which could be a possibility? I think that's a position I'm close to. So I think these two questions are there. And yeah, I mean, with Swatantra Party, I think the centrist, or like it's at the center. And I think this conversation is also called Centrefield because we're trying to find reclaim what is at the center in a world where things are polarized. So yeah, so you can take a pick, either economics, politics connection or non-violent economics in today's age, and then we can segue into present.
And both are really great questions.
So maybe we can go one at a time. Yeah, maybe we can go one at a time then, Parth. So maybe, I don't know, yeah, feel free to pick one.
Before I answer that, let me, I think, just cite one author, who I have been reading lately, Mr. Dharampal. So I knew about his famous book called The Beautiful Tree, which documents the Indian education system in the pre-British times. Right? And much of the documentation that Dharampal uses is based on what the British themselves had documented in India. And so he's collected all of those reports, government reports and other commissions which were established by the British to collect information about what education system India had. And he put it together in this really beautiful book called The Beautiful Tree. And I think great insight into Indian education system. I recently learned also about his other writing, and which is relevant to what we were discussing about Panchayati Raj and decentralization. So he has a book called Panchayat Raj as the basis of Indian polity, right? Published in 1962. It's a great history of how Indian sort of system of informal sort of association other have evolved over a period of time, and how that could have continued moving into after independence, right? And then it's a similar one that he has on Indian science and technology. It's quite a big book that he wrote, looking at technology in India in the sort of older times. Right? And I find that to one person who seems to have done quite a bit of work and largely sort of overlooked by I think academia, by people like us who are generally interested in understanding the situation within the Indian context. So I would recommend to your listeners the work by Dharampal across the board, right? In Indian technology, in Panchayati Raj, in the education system. It's a really fantastic work, and which is all sort of evidence-based. It's not just theories. He pretty much provides all the work he has done is largely what happened in India and documenting that. So that's in my
absolutely. I think in fact it's interesting to bring this up, Parth, because the other people and thinkers have been in conversations with also have been influenced by Dharampal's work and actually also had personal engagements and encounters with Dharampal, and they've been sent on quests by him as well. So yeah, it's interesting how a figure like that re-emerges now in today's context. So thanks for bringing that.
Yeah, and this is his centenary, and there's a sort of a lot of celebrations are going on, a lot of workshops are being organized on his work. I attended one recently on his education policy. His daughter, Geeta Dharampal, who was a professor in Germany, is now back in India after, since he has retired. And she has been leading this effort. So I think it's a great effort to support and join to bring this work to a larger number of people in India. Having said that, I think on the issue of non-violent economics, I think that's really a great phrase. I had not really thought of something along those lines. But I've been thinking quite a lot about the idea of non-violence. Just as a personal story to start with, I became sort of vegetarian while reading Gandhi's book, autobiography, on a train. When I was reading it, I always sort of thought of Gandhi's idea of non-violence as a more of a political strategy. Right? But when I read the book a little closely, I realized that it was central to his view of the world and view of, I think, human life and life in general in the globe. And I saw that really is the key fundamental principle, right? I think we can talk about many other things, but I think unless you are able to practice non-violence and find ways to enhance that, right, as much as possible and reduce the violence part of it in the overall society, you cannot really build the kind of society that we all expect to have. I think in politics, obviously, it's quite clear what it means, and of course, there's a long history to it. In economics, I think there's a lot that we need to think about. How do we apply this idea of non-violence in economics? And I think economics has two dimensions. One, of course, is a transaction that happens between two human beings, right? Buying and selling, exchange process, which is one part of economics. And second is the raw material of economics, which is obviously is a natural environment. And I think so far we have focused much on the exchange part of it, right? Production and distribution and consumption part of it, not as much on the resource of economics part of it. And of course, one approach is the current environmental sort of thinking, and you can take that approach. I think there's an interesting challenge there, that if you want to maintain somewhat modern lifestyle, right? And the benefits of modern lifestyles, comfort, the choices that we have, the longevity that we enjoy, the long life that we enjoy. How can you sustain those things and at the same time be able to be responsible to the larger ecosystem? And I think economics still has to deal with that part of it. I do feel that the exchange part of economics is largely non-violent, and that's I think we should think a little deeper about that. So yes, at one level, of course, all transactions that happen in economics are voluntary transactions, right? So when I work for a company, I'm not being compelled to work in a sense for one particular company. I usually have a choice of places to work, and I choose one place that serves my needs and interests better, right? So in that sense, of course, all these transactions are voluntary transactions, and therefore one can argue they are non-violent. Though at a deeper level, many have argued, as you know, that yes, at one level they are voluntary, but they are not really voluntary. I think that distinction between voluntary and really voluntary is really important. And thinking through that distinction is also, I think, very critical to understanding how one builds non-violent economics. Right? As you know,
I just want to quickly link this. Sorry, but I just want to quickly link this with also the idea of Swaraj and reclaiming one's sense of agency, because I think in the past also in our conversations, it's like not to infantilize the individual also. So I also wonder, for example, if I see fairness cream advertising, can I be rational enough to say that this is trying to push some buttons of insecurity in me and walk away? Not everybody can do that, but I just wonder whether in fact, Gandhiji's idea of Swaraj can be taken into saying that in face of a lot of advertising and behavioral onslaught, I am going to hold my agency and sovereignty, and not cooperate with this. So I'm just wondering if there's one link there with Gandhian ideas of reining in your own senses and your own things to truly reclaim the voluntarism. So just couldn't resist throwing that in. Sorry to interrupt your flow there, but I just thought there was a clear, nice link.
No, I think it's a perfectly, I think, then of course in economics, we say caveat emptor, the buyer beware, right? So we expect buyers to be aware of what choices they are making and how they are making those choices. It's easier said than done in practice, obviously, and people are susceptible, as we know now from much of the behavior science research and literature, that we have certain inherent biases and the ways of working consciously, subconsciously, that influences our choices in a ways that even sometimes we ourselves don't understand. So having said that, I think you are right that you really have to empower the individual and trust them to make many of these choices. And the market economy obviously depends on that, right? Because if you're going to protect individuals from every mistake or folly, then obviously, as you said, we would have to turn individuals into infants and be controlling of their lives in ways that, of course, nobody would want to see as desirable.
Yeah. No, I also took that segue, Parth, and we'll return to the main thread of the conversation, was that every idea or ideological position would have a certain conception of a human being. And I feel that when we have to conceive of a human being, it may be valuable to draw from Gandhiji's ideas of Swaraj as a self-regulation at an individual level also. And it, to me, ties in perfectly well with the idea of liberty, freedom, agency, like really imagining an individual not as a weak, susceptible individual, but eventually visualizing a human being as a conscious consumer with agency, aware of one's choices and exercising that. So, I mean, the ideal state, I'm saying that maybe reality is not there, but we need to take an assumption or a position. And I'm like, then should we take an assumption or a position of saying that eventually we're dreaming of a society where more and more individuals are conscious agency exercising actors. So, yeah.
I think that also links to the education system, right? I think Gandhi also talked about that in some of his writings, that much of how individuals behave, right, is of course part of the culture, but also part of the education that they receive. And right. I think if you're going to help individuals to be able to govern themselves, right, self-governing individuals, then education system would have to play an important role in that process. And I think it's surprising when you look back on our own education that we have gone through, that how little has been of relevance to living meaningful life, right?
Yes.
And I think this really is a very important challenge of thinking through. People spend 12 plus 3 or 4 years, like 16 years, pretty much in our education system, right? At the minimum, in some sense.
Right.
And despite that, the things they should have learned to be able to lead sort of productive, meaningful life, very little of that has been done, and particularly in terms of values and ways of thinking about life itself, right? Being a self-reflecting life that you want to have. And none of those things are done in a systemic way in the education system. So I fully agree. The Swaraj has two components. One, of course, is the individual, self-governing individual. And second, of course, as the name implies, Raj is a sort of self-governing systems within which individuals operate. And so my work in public policy is focus on that part of it. And this is looking at the system and how do you design the rules of the system so that they are self-governing, self-enforcing in a way, because they are so consistent with what individuals would want to do, that you don't really have to impose too much coercion to get those rules to be followed, right? And so I broadly think about rules right, as governing the interactions that happens in sort of Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar, right? So one will think about that rules are governing all these interactions within Samaj, within Sarkar, and within Bazaar, and across the three sectors, right?
Yes.
And then how do you create those policies, those rules, the constitution, in a sense, which is our meta policy document, right? And I think that's a part of policy work that has been done, of course, quite systematically by many people in different sort of strands, right? So that's one part of Swaraj. So looking at the self-governing rules within which Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar operate. And second part, obviously, is the individuals themselves. So it's clear that even if you have all the great rules, if individuals are not really motivated in a way they should be, you can still have pretty badly functioning system.
Yes, yes,
Right.
absolutely. You need it at both levels, right?
Yeah, and if you have all individuals behaving well, the system is badly designed, rules are badly designed, then at some point this good behavior will break down, because the bad
Yes,
behavior would get rewarded so much more that people will find difficult to stay on the good behavior for long, right? And
right.
so I think finding that balance between Swaraj as self-governing individual and Swaraj as the self-governing system.
Lovely.
So unless you have both of those things together in somehow,
That's quite
you
powerful.
cannot sustain
Yes,
a good society.
yes. Very, very, very crisply put, Parth. Really, and the lovely phrase, self-governing individual. Love that phrase also, and how the coherence is at both levels. Yeah. So, and was this also connected to Swatantra's position, or is this now more of your thinking, which is a fresh combination of Gandhian ideas and liberal ideas?
I think it's a part of the debates that we have been having for quite some time, right? So at one level, it makes sense that you want to know what Gandhi has been doing and what is social reformers, right? So you don't want to just have a ban on sati, for example, but you want to inculcate values in individuals who would not practice such an inhumane thing, right?
Right.
So how do you balance that, in a sense, inculcating those values in individuals, and therefore they are motivated on their own, not to engage in such practices, and at the same time build a system which would keep and reinforcing that behavior.
Right.
And I think that's a sort of area that I've been thinking, and I realized that now that you have to make both work. It's not either or. For a long time, frankly, yes. I thought if you get the system right, the information and incentives right, in a sense, right? Thinking from economic point of view, then individuals will behave properly. Right? And that's largely what economic conception of the rules is, right? The rules are about incentives. And if you get incentives right, people would behave. And that does work to a large extent. It does not work fully. And I think you need to, therefore I realized that you need to have both. So self-governing systems and self-governing individuals. Only then I think they both have to reinforce each other.
Yeah, one connection also, Parth, that I'm finding is that reducing the use of force and coercion that you mentioned, and the idea of non-violence. And I think the way I understand the liberal ideas of freedom and liberty, I think they're all talking very similar things, right? You want to reduce the number of pushes on the individual and try to build that individual sovereignty. And I think a lot of it is about minimizing force on individuals and allowing them to be freer and freer in their choice making. So I think that was also a link. So if non-violence economics, if there is anything else on that you want to share, I heard you also say that non-violence in the raw material side and how do we do the ecology. I'm curious about one more before we go to the politics economics question, is that I broadly find myself as a techno-optimist, right? So I say that, okay, yes, we need to be frugal. Yes, we need to, conserve resources. And at the same time, human innovation and ingenuity will triumph. And maybe through our innovation and recycling and zero waste, I don't know how, but we'll figure a way for people to live comfortably. And I get into debates with my friends saying that, it needs 7 Earths to support everybody living at this lifestyle. But I say 7 Earths with the current technology. Maybe with the future technology, you may not need 7 Earths, and you take that as a design constraint. So I don't know where you lie on the techno spectrum. I know Gandhiji wasn't a techno-optimist. He was like, minimize the use of technology. But now we're in a world where kind of the cat is out of the bag kind of a thing. So I'm curious about your position on technology, though I know it's opening a whole new thread, but I think I want to just link it back to saying that you had spoken about non-violence at the level of ecology, raw material, sourcing. Do you think technology can redeem us there and get better and better at managing this?
So on this issue, I'm sort of so influenced and I think convinced in some sense that the ultimate resource is the human brain or human being.
Yes.
Right. And it's not so much the material resources that matter. And I think technology, as you pointed out, is a very important part of it. It all comes from the human mind. And I think human mind is what really we should be focusing on, like, to solve some of these problems. And indirectly, that of course makes me also optimistic about what human mind can do, right? And therefore, problems that can be solved through our own efforts, right? So the greatest resource on earth is human mind, and not so much the forest and oceans in that sense, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I'm also quite optimistic about what human mind can do. Yes, I think there's a lot of skepticism around that. I remember I sort of came to this view during the debate on population. I don't know if you remember this, but when the 50th anniversary of India's independence in 1997, when actually CCS was also launched at the same time, the Indian Parliament had a special session, and the Parliament debated about all the key challenges India faces moving into the future. And one challenge that they all agreed on, and there's a long statement issued by the Parliament on this, was the population problem. So I found that sort of so ironic that here is the representative of the people, which are the parliamentarians, MPs, right, sitting in the parliament and saying to the people that you are the biggest problem for the country.
Yes, it is very ironic.
So how is that possible? But I think that mindset, I think if you look at the debate even today, right, is around that. And many of the government policies that if you have more than 2 children, you would not qualify for this or would not qualify for that, is about controlling population. Right? So I think during that debate, thinking about it, looking at the history and all of that, I sort of came to my own sort of conviction that human mind is the ultimate resource, and we should cherish that as much as possible.
Yes, I completely, I resonate with that position for sure. So maybe Parth, you want to transition from the nonviolent economics piece where we've already touched on some of these ideas to the economics politics connection. Or again, I know this is like a very sprawling organic podcast. So one more thread that is opening up for me as we speak is that there are status quoists who also defend, like Hans Rosling or even Bill Gates for that matter, who consistently keep a stand that the world is getting back better. And they cherry pick some of these parameters and say that, the world is getting better on all these parameters. So there is also that edge when we talk about technology and techno-optimism, that yes, the world is getting better and yes, we are moving towards abundance. And at the same time, that doesn't absolve us from being frugal or being mindful consumers either. Almost like a paradox. The technology will keep creating abundance, but if that abundance spoils our moral fiber, then we are kind of doomed, right? So that, I think, links back to what you're saying at both levels. There is a systemic level where technology is innovating and making lives better. And yet in the times we live in, at an individual level, like a Gandhian idea of cultivating simplicity to whatever extent possible, I think to me that paradox seems to be a position I can defend. Rather than going completely Gandhian frugal, we joke about saying, that in Blue Ribbon Movement, we need to have our cappuccinos and hot chocolate and not feel guilty about it. And that the universe is abundant. Like innately, if you look at a plant or a tree, it flowers. There is so much abundance in the universe. And at the same time, as a trustee of the planet, we have to have our own frugality, our own level. So I don't know where do you see the universe as abundant? Do you see frugality? Do you see how do you look at this whole question of technology, abundance, frugality?
I think that's sort of one key the aspect that may distinguish what we are thinking and talking here versus what many others talk on the other side, in a sense, is the fact that whatever you think is appropriate for the individual, do you want to legislate that for the whole group, for the society or the world, right? So simplicity and frugality are, of course, very appropriate values and virtues, you can say, for individuals to practice and nurture, right? But do I really want to legislate that?
Definitely not, right? Definitely not.
I think that is where our sort of key challenge lies, right? So what kind of rules are appropriate for the governing system, right? And whose moral values and ideas should be incorporated in that system, right? Versus what, of course, individually we want to promote and think is a good thing to do, right? As a moral behavior or ethical behavior as individuals, right? I think that is a tension that I think we need to think a little deeply about, because I think immediate instinct from almost, I think, all of us, that we believe that this is a good thing for individuals as individuals, so therefore it must be a rule for the system as a whole. Right? And so I think just take technology for example. Yes, we want to have simple life, but do you want a system designed so that we don't allow or discourage more technological innovations? Right? Or do you want a system where you encourage them? Or do you want to have a system which is neutral to both in a way? It's also possible to some extent. Right? So I think so that distinction between individual and system is also very important, and which is my sort of phrasing of earlier about self-governing individual and some self-governing systems.
Right, right.
And I think that's where I also see a big challenge for even us, right? The idea of trusteeship that you mentioned. Right? At one level, it makes sense, right? As individuals, you want people to behave that way, that this wealth that you have, the resources that you command. And of course, you may have acquired all of those things legitimately and morally. Right? It's possible to do that. It's not that all wealth is exploitation. But you deal with that wealth that you acquired in a different way as a trustee of that wealth, right? So I see that's a great sort of moral behavior virtue for us to advocate and practice as individuals.
Right. Yeah, I think in fact this is an important point, Parth, that moral power cannot be legislated. And another leader who I admire and has one of the highest moral intelligence, I would say, is Rajaji, P.V. Rajgopal of Ekta Parishad. And in conversations with him, he spoke a bit about moral power and how through active sacrifice, one can cultivate a certain moral power. And it's really a very intangible source of power. And I think along with legislation, which allows freedom, one also needs to counterbalance that with moral power of inspiring individuals who are like a voice of conscience. I remember like Nehruji took the plan to Vinoba Bhave at that time, and Vinoba Bhave said that there is no place for villages in this, so I don't agree with the plan. The civil society at that time had such a moral power or a shared history of fighting the freedom struggle that the government would check in with the moral leaders. And I think as consumers, maybe the moral leadership is reduced because we get reduced to individualized consumers with our with our limitations. So just it's an interesting dimension that in visualizing a society, it's not only law, but really moral power that can also bring in a certain influence, new role models who are balancing these questions, answering them in their own ways. And I think there is a subtle moral power field each of us also carries. Like if you go around and if I'm meeting you, certain conversations will naturally get evoked, certain energy will naturally get evoked. So I think there is something definitely there at some stage worth unpacking as well.
You mentioned about Vinoba Bhave. I think the Bhudan movement, right?
Right.
Through which he tried to sort of redistribute land, which was sort of movement based on moral power, right? Persuasion. And of course, we also tried to do the same thing through legal power, right? By laws that we made. And I think it's interesting to sort of compare and contrast to what extent what has worked, right?
Right.
And my sense is whatever little history that I have, I know that a lot of land which was given to Vinoba Bhave did not get distributed to the individuals. And largely because obviously the political system was not designed to deliver on that distribution, right? And somehow the lack of legal systems and the capacity of the government and the bureaucracy to execute that, we could not really achieve the kind of land distribution that could have happened without the coercion of the state, in a sense, just by state facilitating that process that Bhave has started. So I think it's interesting interesting to study the sort of Bhudan movement and see what lessons we can learn in this context about moral power versus the.
I think they have to be in synergy for sure. Yeah, they have to be in synergy. And this is such a fascinating topic in itself, because also Vinoba in his reflection post Bhudan figured that only one towering individual doesn't cut it. Like you need a collective of moral individuals to build a field in the society to hold a certain standard. So I think there's definitely the intangibles, I feel, that the normal measurement systems can't capture, that we have to factor in our models also. That like moral power can't be captured on an index or a measurement, and yet it does exist, and our country has a history of showing how moral power can move things. So so maybe Parth, good time to go into, sorry, you had something to share?
No, go ahead. I think you want to go into politics and economics.
I was wondering, because and also I think just with Bhudan, since we're on Vinoba, maybe a good transition would be that Vinoba has spoken about the 5 Shaktis, the Vidwan Shakti, the Jan Shakti, Sajjan Shakti, and there is a Mahajan Shakti, the strength of the wealthy class in supporting this, and Sarkar Shakti. Those are the 5. So Mahajan Shakti, people who are wealthy and the wealthy class, I think that's a segue, because I'm curious about what you think about the influence of economics on politics, and therefore the reverse cycle also of how politics then furthers maybe crony capitalism or access to public resources at very low prices or rent-seeking behavior. So just curious about this link, saying that isn't economics such a driving force of politics today, or do you see it the other way, that politics is kind of the key player and economics is subservient, or they're in tandem in the bed together? Like what's your take?
I think sort of maybe I'm not sure I'm addressing your question directly or not, but my sort of broader take is that what is currently broken more is the politics and not so much economics. Even though I think if you listen to the experts and the commentary, even globally, not just in India, all the focus is on how to fix economics. Right? And there's surprisingly little conversation about how to fix politics.
Right.
Somehow we take the political situation and behavior of politicians and political parties and even bureaucrats as sort of God-given. Right? Nothing much can be done. This is how they are. Right? This is how they will collect money for elections, and this is how they will spend money, right? And we, in a sense, just have given up on any sense of propriety in our political arena. And we use so much sort of pressure on the economics part of the life, in a sense, right, to meet the demands of moral behavior. Right? So I'm not saying that we should not do that in economics. Obviously, we should continue doing it. I think the reason why the system doesn't work as a whole is because we have moved further, in my view, in economic domain, right? So I just give you one simple example. Just compare the Companies Act of India, right? That governs the corporations and companies in the country, right? And see the rules and regulations we have in the Companies Act, right? And the requirements of transparency, accountability, all of that built into those rules and regulations. Right? Yes, they are not perfect. Obviously, we would have to keep improving them. But just where we are today, just compare the Companies Act and compare with the People's Representation Act, which is the act that we have in the country to govern our political parties and political affairs, broadly speaking. Right? And I mean, you see that this huge chasm between the two. Right? I mean, companies, we expect them to do certain things just because they are publicly incorporated companies. Right? There is hardly any such standard we maintain for political parties. Right? And we sort of take it, well, kya kar sakte hai, right? Election Commission, of course, can't do much because they're appointed by the same government. How can they enforce the law on the government, right? I think we just have found so many excuses. It just boggles my mind when I think about the political situation that, we justify everything the politicians do and somehow or the other.
Yes,
right?
yes,
So when somebody says certain very ugly things, they say, oh, but the politician is a product of our own society. What he or
right,
she says or
right.
does is just a reflection of who we are. Right?
Yes, yes.
And it's amazing that we never use that phrase to describe a corrupt businessman.
Ah,
Right?
nice. Yeah,
We
that's a
never say
great
that,
point.
oh, this guy, doing this scam, Saj Mehta, whoever that may be, it's
Mm,
nothing wrong because it's just a reflection of Indian society. I mean, that he's
right.
part of us. Right? It's
That's
interesting
so
how we
true.
justify
Yes,
and rationalize the bad
yes,
behavior in the political arena.
yes.
And so I
That's
think, thinking and take lately, looking at, when I came to thinking about this in the context of the global populism, what is happening, in that space, and thinking about what could be done to address it. And I saw that much of the discussion is on fixing economics, right? Either it's in terms of the universal uh, payments being made to individuals or various contexts of those kinds, right? Anti-globalization to some extent, right? All of those things which are sort of focused on economics of our life. But there's hardly any discussion about the politics of our life. And I think, as everybody knows, I mean, ultimately, no, the old science of economics was called political economy. And for a good reason, because people understood that economics cannot exist on its own. It exists in the context of the politics of the society.
Right.
And the politics has a lot to do with how economics works. Right? And you cannot fix economics unless you fix politics, frankly.
Right. Okay.
And I think we need to have that larger conversation about fixing the politics. And just starting my one simple mantra is to start with the People's Representation Act and see, can we convert that into something similar to Companies Act?
Lovely.
Right? What kind of moral behavior, standards, disclosure requirements we want to have from our political parties and political operatives.
Right. Yeah.
But going well down there, I think just a starting point, right?
Yes.
And I think there's a lot, about public choice.
Yes.
Of course, public choice doesn't give you solutions, but it gives you great insight into the problems in the working of a democracy that we have. Right?
Do you want to unpack public choice a bit, Parth, for people who may not be familiar? Because for me also, public choice, like school vouchers, for example, is one thing that it evokes, or like giving people the choice of what to do with their tax money. That's my understanding. But when you say public choice,
no, voucher probably not so much public choice. But I think the key idea is that public choice, what it does basically is that Jim Buchanan, one of the sort of founders of public choice, in a sense, school of thought in economics. He said, no, I go to economic class when he was a student himself. And I see the basic assumption underlying all economics is that people are self-interested and they act for their own benefit. Right? And so, and after leaving economic class, I go to a political science class. And the basic assumption in political science is that those who govern are publicly interested. They govern in public interest and not in self-interest. Right? So the whole political science is based largely on the assumption that whoever system we design, whoever comes to govern the nation or a system is going to behave in a public spirited manner.
Yes.
Right. And that was, I think, the great insight that he had, that how is it possible the same human being,
yes,
we expect them to, when they engage in economic life, somehow to be self-interested, right? So I used to use the example of Vijay Mallya earlier. It's now that example to use. That Vijay Mallya, of course, is a businessman and used to be a very active member of Rajya Sabha, right, for quite some time. And so do we expect Vijay Mallya to sort of behave in public-spirited manner when he sits in the Rajya Sabha office? And very differently in a self-centered manner when he sits into his company office.
Right.
It's the same Vijay Mallya in both places.
Yes.
Right. So I think so that is a huge insight of public choice. And that's what I think Jim Buchanan did, is to apply the same assumption of self-interest as we normally apply to economic actors to political actors, which means politicians, voters, and bureaucrats primarily. And also what he calls special interests, various lobbying groups which exist in the political space. Right? So public choice is about understanding the behavior of these four actors from the viewpoint of their self-interest.
Right.
Right. And what is interesting about public choice is it doesn't condemn these actors. It's not that we come to conclude they are all evil people. It simply says that we need to be focused, just like we focus on company being profit maximizer. Right? And you can earn profit honestly also, you can earn profit dishonestly also. Right? It's not that just because we say that you are a profit maximizer, somehow there's a condemnation of you. Right? It's just recognizing the fact that unless you earn a profit, you cannot survive in the system. Right? It's a basic fact. If you keep making losses, well, of course, unless you are a startup, you keep making losses. You can't really stay in the business for long, right? The basic requirement of being staying in business for Narayan Murthy or Ratan Tata for that matter is to have a profitable company at the minimum. Right? And so we recognize that fact. Similarly, we have to recognize in political arena that the self-interest of politician is actually to get re-elected.
Right.
And much of their activities, actions, behavior is driven by that. Part of getting re-elected also means serving the public.
Yes.
Just like part of being profitable, right? Large part of being profitable is also serving the consumer.
Yes. Yes.
Right. And I think understanding that insight of public choice, and then how do we then recalibrate, recraft our democracy, right? To include that understanding. I think we have not really done much of that thinking. So as I say, public choice gives you good insights into the challenges of democracy or a political system, broadly speaking. Democracy is one, of course, type of political system. But of course, we still don't have a solutions to those challenges that public choice identifies. I think I keep saying quite often to students when I talk about public choice that there is a Nobel Prize waiting for anyone who can figure out how to create the invisible hand of politics.
Wow.
As we have the invisible hand of economics. Right? So, and at the very fundamental level, this idea of invisible hand is that when the people are self-interested, but they work in a particular system of private property and open competition,
right,
that self-interest action will converge in a way to lead to a public good.
Yes.
Right. And that's the invisible hand that drives or motivates individuals who are self-interested to produce public good. Right? And answer what is the invisible hand? Actually, is an institution of private property and contract right? And open competition.
Yes.
So we have a system with those two properties, broadly speaking.
Yes.
That will align the self-interest of individuals with the public interest.
Right. Right.
And so we have not figured out the invisible hand of politics.
Yes. Yes.
So how do we align, once we understand the self-interest of the political actors, how do we create a system so that that self-interest actually also produces public good and not just what we see today in politics, not just in India, around the world, right? So that's, I think, my larger sort of commentary on what needs to be focused more on. I think we are focusing too much on economics and very little on politics.
Interesting. That's an interesting clarity. And I think what you're sharing, Parth, evokes so many things for me. For example, the barrier to entry in politics in one way is low, but in one way is very high, because political parties have hijacked that space and so well. And I think between Samaj Sarkar and Bazaar, Sarkar is very good at exercising its power to keep amplifying its power and push the other two. And of course, it's a healthy tension, but I would say that Samaj to me at the current point seems fairly fragile and weak in face of Sarkar for sure. Bazaar, we still have a choice as consumers, but but also I think the technology of democracy itself is a very ancient one and it hasn't evolved, right? We're still stuck in a very plain majoritarian vote once in 5 years or 3 times in 5 years. It's almost like the data, the feedback to the system is in such delayed feedback loops, and combined with the fact that re-elections mean that long-term planning in open societies is harder. I in fact feel that, say, China and Russia can actually do 20, 30, 40 years because they know that this guy is going to be in power, however imperfect that may be. I'm saying that this dimension of populist politics, because you have to get re-elected, so some measures which are short run unviable but long run better, I think those get disincentivized. And one last thing I wanted to kind of share and then hear your response was, I was also thinking of this in two time horizons, right? Like the short run time horizon, what you're saying in terms of public choice, people acting in self-interest is definitely a very viable, workable option. I also wonder if a long-term vision could be, how do we move power to people who have public interest? Because for me, I mean, there is a very deep self-interest in doing public work. Like I would say, yes, you are motivated very deeply, individualistically, but like you and I feel are also concerned about the larger good. And like this conversation, for example, the incentive of this conversation, while it's the joy of connection and all, there is a larger interest of this conversation that we're having. So I, from my personal first-hand experience, feel that there are people who've had their basic needs met, were not traumatized, so they need attention or ambition, but they're genuinely people who move to a self-actualization, care for the world kind of level. And how do we move power to those people? Because it's almost like you have to move power to the people who want it the least so that they decentralize it and share it, right? And I think if in the long run the society can solve for that problem and put power in the hands of morally tall people, maybe, and it sounds like a far ideal, but I feel like maybe a 50 or 100-year aspiration would be to eventually move power to people who are in public interest and public service.
What is really, really interesting about your statement is that we already had a system that I mean, by and large, not fully, but by and large, achieved what you're talking about, which gave political power to people who had a larger public interest at heart. That's actually what they want to do, right? And I think the challenge, maybe let me just say what the system was, and maybe we can talk about why, what's wrong with the current system in that sense. And so, I mean, it's a now also accepted sort of approach in political science called Swatism. So that basically means that randomly selected people are put in charge. Now, so first step in the process is that you volunteer yourself. So something called citizen assembly, for example, which is another common model now being tried out around the world. So suppose a particular problem, this is, for example, Ireland has to decide on the issue of abortion. Being a Catholic country, obviously no political party wanted to touch that issue. So for them, it was a disaster, right? To talk about that issue in a political context. So people also realized that no political party is going to solve this problem for us. It's just not going to work. So they took this idea of citizen assembly. So people say, do you want to volunteer yourself to discuss and debate this issue with other citizens? Right? And among the people who volunteer, be few 100,000 or few million, I don't remember the exact number. They randomly selected about 120 or so people. Right? And they met every weekend. They are working people by and large, ordinary citizens. They met every weekend to discuss, debate. They had access to resources. The government will provide them. They can call any expert they want to listen to. Right? So they have access to anything they need to be able to make an informed discussion. Right? And after a few months of this discussion dialogue among that group of people, citizens, they came to a conclusion and made a recommendation to the parliament. So this could be our position on this issue, a legal sort of position on the issue, right? And that was largely accepted.
Lovely.
Right? And I think so. I mean, this is system. Citizen assembly is a very old idea, and of course, it was, as you know, the Greek democracy was not by election of the kind that we have. It was also by random selection. Right? Of course, citizens were very limited. So who counted as citizen was very limited, right? Only some people counted as citizens. But among the citizens that Roman Empire declared them as citizens, the public offices are given randomly. Right? And so I think it's a very powerful idea. I think we talk a lot about randomness in economics, in a sense, right? But we don't appreciate the power of randomness in politics. And I think randomness to rescue is sort of my slogan for politics. So how can we randomize people who get to positions of decision making? And also at the same time, create situations where decision making is not limited to one or two individuals, but a larger group of citizens.
Right. Right.
And that's a citizen assembly idea. Right. So I think there are older systems. It's interesting when you, and I found out there's a system in South India. I forget the name now.
Kudam?
Kudam, was his name?
Kudam is one of those systems of decision making, which is contextual.
Yeah, so they would put names in a pot. Those who want to serve that office, right? And then randomly would somebody pick out, then cheat from the pot. And then that person will get that office for a fixed period of time.
Nice. Yeah.
And my sense is that it's really, when you look into how that would work compared to how the current system works, my sense is that we cannot do worse than what we have by putting randomness to use.
That's such an interesting proposition, Parth. That's a really interesting one. And maybe citizen assemblies, also along with the 73rd, 74th Amendment, I think there's so much promise in them, and we've not fully realized the promise of the 74th Amendment, for sure. 73rd, 74th area sabhas and maybe citizen assemblies are also a pathway.
But I think what is different about this way of thinking about politics and who plays that role in politics, right? It's even way beyond 73rd, 74th Amendment. Those two amendments, of course, are great. They still will keep you in the same system.
Yes, but here you're saying randomness might be a way out of the system.
Right? It's created a very different system altogether.
Interesting, very interesting.
So today you need to be somebody like Modi, for example, to be able to run for office. Right. You need to have that kind of stamina to deliver speeches across the country. All of those things that requires to be a successful political candidate. Right?
Yes.
Those skills are very different, frankly.
Yes.
Then the skills required to be a good administrator.
Yes, absolutely. Right? Yeah.
And no part of our life, in any other part of life, we would not conflate those two things.
Yes.
Right. But somehow in politics, we have always combined these two things. The guy who is a great campaigner is rarely going to be a great administrator.
Absolutely. That's a very sharp, incisive analysis, Parth. Yeah.
And so I think combining those two sort of positions in one is just a recipe for disaster. And that's exactly what we have in our politics.
Yes, it can't get worse, like you said. So I think, and I think this deserves an entire podcast, Parth, because I think what you're proposing is a radically different system, and it would be so interesting to unpack how its ripples would be in various ways. So I think I want to earmark this one as a radically new political alternative and have the audacity to imagine outside the current box. I think that conversation is hardly happening anywhere. Because it's almost like you said, I think we are hypnotized by treating the politics of the current times as a given, forgetting that we have the capacity to reimagine that. And in economics, we have entrepreneurship, but like political entrepreneurship is zero. It's like, So I think there's so much there. So Parth, just to move now towards the closing of this conversation, I want to move to this idea that I've been working on around the idea of Centrefield. And the basic intent is to go beyond binaries. The basic intent is that a polarized society acting only on ideology cannot make contextual decisions. And the world is too chaotic, it's too rapidly changing and too complex. So acting only from ideology will not produce the best outcomes, whereas acting from the context, what is immediately in question, and then solving that through dialogue might produce better outcomes than just blindly acting from a single ideology. And perhaps certain maxims can be agreed on. For example, to me, nonviolence seems to be a maxim, or another interesting one that came to me was honest and peaceful people have a right to be left alone. So maybe the society can agree on certain maxims. And I know even that is hard. There is nothing like an India consensus that can ever get achieved. I think the intent of Centrefield is to go beyond binaries, to find an ideological position which can land in the center. And to me, the closest inspiration has been Swatantra Party in many ways, because I think like I said, your ideas, I caught them as a youngster, and I think that's the time when ideas are very influential. And then, of course, I saw the merit in them, definitely, for them to stick on. So just if you had to imagine a centrist politics in today's highly polarized world, and in a world where centrist parties are failing all over the world, I think even in Germany and in UK, centrist politics is not. But I'm hoping that the pendulum swings. So just anything around how do we socially in a polarized world, what would a center look like, and what would a centrist politics or an Indic centrist politics, I'm not even saying a modern Western one, work. So any thoughts, ideas, inspirations, pointers for something like that to evolve? And sorry, one more last thing to add to that is also what an Indian vision for India would be like. I try to frame it as saying that first few decades we had a Russian vision for India, and then an American vision for India, and now maybe a Chinese vision for India. What is an Indian vision for India? You know, grounded in our culture, grounded in our sort of values. So yeah, so any pointers, any thoughts, any questions you would like to leave us with on this theme?
I think let me say this first, that what you're trying to do through this sort of centrist forum and these dialogues and conversations that you are doing, Abhishek, is really of great value. I think it's much needed, and I hope that you find the energy and resources to continue to build on this effort. So I agree with you that we do need to work towards Indian vision for India. And I mean, of course, it sounds sometimes tried to say that, frankly. If sort of anybody would say, okay, India has been the oldest civilization, and you guys don't even have a vision for India. But yes, we also know that practically that's an idea that needs to be thought through, publicly discussed, debated, to be part of our sort of public conversation in a broader sense, right? And so I think it's a very important part of what you are doing here. And I hope that it continues.
Thank you.
Now, in terms of the ideologies and all of that, I know sometimes labels, libertarian, liberal, left liberal, whatever labels we are using, there are useful sort of shorthands for TV debates, but they don't really get you too far into answering real challenges.
Right.
I think anyone who has done even decent thinking around any of the problems they are interested in realizes that ideology does not really help you solve all of those problems. It may give you some direction in terms of where you should be looking for solutions. But the solutions are not going to come from pure ideology.
Right. Yes.
And I think one disservice that maybe I'm also guilty of that myself is that we have done to our intellectual life in India is by taking these labels too seriously.
Right.
Give you an example. I mean, even today I get asked to write for various places because they think I'm a libertarian. I will bring this point of view. Right? And that also has made me sort of shy away from public participation. I feel that I don't want to just project an image of myself as a libertarian, and that's all who I am. Right? And I think most people feel that as a deeper level, it's very unsatisfying label. Right? It also, I think, restricts you in terms of what you can do, because people expect you just because a label that put on your head and turn everything into that system, right? So whatever you say is, oh, of course, Parth would say this because he's a libertarian.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so there is no really possibility of a deeper dialogue, right? And I think it's true not just with people who oppose our ideas, libertarian ideas, for example, it's among libertarians themselves, right? There's a lot of this within the, I think it's true, of course, as you know, in the other side also, the lefty or communist camp, they also split up, they couldn't work together. Beyond a certain point, right? I think that's true, or same holds true for libertarians, right? So I think the labels are really doing disservice to our larger intellectual life, and I don't know how I can break out of it myself, having carried that label on my head for a long time. But I think we have to recognize at the higher level of dialogue that putting those labels and viewing person with that prism all the time is just not going to be conducive to any fruitful conversation.
Yes.
Right? It's just going to be rehashing of the old thing. You are going to see me in the same light, whatever I may say. Right? So I think I see the very big challenge for us, because politics is now driven by those labels, right? And of course, politics is always driven by those labels. but now it has become even far worse in some
Yes,
sense.
yes, yes.
And so how do you rise above those labels? I think if your effort brings people with these labels together, with different labels together, I think it will be great service that we are able to do a much deeper conversation about the Indian vision of India.
Lovely. No, I think just one thing quickly, Parth, I want to add here is that I see you more as a Parthian rather than a libertarian, because I've seen an evolution in your thought, and compared to the classic libertarians, we've always found you more open to listening to ideas. And I almost feel like the position of being 80% liberal / libertarian is more than being 100%, because you get close to other ideas. And I think with you, always found the space to actually engage in dialogue rather than in evangelism. And definitely want to acknowledge that about you in terms of your own evolution of thought. I think compared to many public intellectuals who get caught into a position and then the rest of their life is defending that position because their reputation is based on that, I think at least my experience of you has been an evolution of thought, and which is quite amazing and inspiring.
That's very kind of you, Abhishek.
Yeah, so I think, anything else, Parth, that comes to your mind? I know I intervened, but I couldn't resist that one. So,
no, I think we had more than an hour. So let's give a break to your listeners.
Yes, thank you, Parth. I think this conversation has opened up more conversations to have these conversations and dialogues on. Thank you so much for your time, Parth. And I'm really looking forward to going deeper into these conversations with you as we...
It's really been great talking to you, Abhishek. And I hope we can do a few more of these sessions.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you.